Ladies and gentlemen, they're at it again. In their bid to overtake the world, KZ has released this. And in this video, I'm looking at the KZ Crinacle CRN, previously known as the KZ ZEX Pro. Let's get it. What's cracking, audio fans? It's David here from Prime Audio Reviews. Here we are with the KZ Crinacle CRN. Bit of a mouthful, that one. From this point on, I'm going to refer to it as the CRN. Now, this is quite an interesting one. First of all, let's talk about the price. It is $33 US roughly, and it's an interesting one because it's got a quite rather exotic driver combination inside. It's a tribrid triple driver unit. It's got one dynamic driver, one magnetostatic driver, and one balanced armature driver. Now, in the original KZ ZEX, they were calling that, instead of a magnetostatic, they were calling it an electret driver. I believe it's the same. I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there you have it. So interesting mix of drivers there, coming in at $33. Who would have even guessed it would be possible a few years ago, man? You know, that was when we were starting to see the early hybrids, you know, single dynamic and a single BA together. And now we're getting into these really exotic mixes. So it's a very interesting time as always, but without any further ado, let's get into this CRN. And we'll start with looking at the shells. And it's your pretty standard KZ shell of late. Not too much different going on there. It got a pretty minimal faceplate. I kind of like that. It has a really nice look to it. Once again, we see these Type C, I think, connectors, or they might be QDC. I'm not sure. It's confusing. Help me out in the comments if you know what exactly is the difference between the Type C and the QDC. Something about polarity with the QDC. Anyway, let's keep going. So, yeah, the shells are very similar indeed to the KZ DQ6 here. A little bit different from the original ZEX Pro, the main difference being these little wings here that weren't on the ZEX. Now, how does that affect the fit and comfort? Well, these fit me pretty well, pretty fine. They are pretty wide. They stick out from my ears a little bit. But apart from that, yeah, comfortable. I've worn these for several hours at a time without having any problems. So there you have it. The build quality is nice. The shells look pretty cool, nice and stealth, nice and low key. So I'm pleased with that. Oh yeah, another major difference between the shell of the CRN and the ZEX is the size of the nozzle. Check this out. Hey, yes, and I think they've enlarged the CRN nozzle to accommodate the balanced armature driver. I could be wrong, but that is my guess. So with all that aside, let's just get right into the sound of the CRN here. And what would I call it? I guess you would say it's a pretty balanced signature. It does have a somewhat bright tonality. It's a little bit on the bright side of neutral in terms of tone, but pretty balanced overall. It's got a very clean sound, very good clarity, very good detail retrieval, but it is just slightly analytical sounding to me, although it's a difficult one. But let's break it down. We'll start with the bass. Now, the bass on the CRN here is heavily skewed towards the sub bass, and if you look at the graph, which I'll put up here, it's a pretty hefty looking bass on the graph, but in reality it's actually quite tame. It's not very big at all, although if you listen to some EDM or hip hop or whatever, they've got those really low kick drums and synth drums, or synth bass I should say. These can get a nice little rumble going, but they're definitely nowhere near a bass head IEM. As for the mid bass, it is fairly subdued. It's a fairly light in quantity. It's a fast mid bass and it's very well controlled. It doesn't have the most texture but it is nice and fast. It's punchy enough, but in a lot of recordings it does sound a little bit dry, especially in the upper bass. Just sounds a little bit dry and kind of lacks a little bit of rhythm. As far as sort of cleanliness goes, it's a very clean sounding bass. You do get that bit of authority from the sub bass, but in a lot of music, for example, a lot of rock music where they don't have a lot of sub bass notes, the mid bass sounds a little bit shy, just a little bit. I feel like I want a little bit more body and punch there. And then we get to the mid range, and yeah, you can see that the lower mid range is somewhat scooped out. That bass starts to fall off pretty quickly after the upper bass, and that gives you pretty neutral mid range, quite lean mid range with lean note size. And it just, I think it lacks a little bit of warmth, but just like the mid bass, the mid range is very clean sounding. There's no muddiness there. There isn't any bass bleed coming across either. But it's not the smoothest or richest mid range. It's pretty much just neutral. Great clarity, as I said, and the detail retrieval on this earphone or IEM is very good indeed. So vocals are nice and clean, they're articulate, not the smoothest of vocals, or not the most intimate or warm or emotive perhaps, but they are very clean, just like the rest of the mid-range. Instruments, as far as timbre of instruments and vocals go, it's pretty on point. However, you do get some sibilance, there is some stridency from vocals and certain instruments as well, particularly percussion instruments. Now that is partly mid-range and part treble, but let's just go with the mid-range now since we're on it. So yeah, there is the occasional sibilance there, and some female vocals sound a little bit harsh, a little bit shouty perhaps. But for the most part, the mid-range sounds pretty good. And finally, we've got the treble, and this is where the CRN really has its major flaw, which is in that 8 kilohertz peak that you can see quite clearly on the graph. And it looks a bit awkward, and it can be a bit awkward. It definitely does introduce some stridency. This is where the CRN gets its bright tone from. And it affects everything from the lowest bass all the way up to the highest treble is affected by that 8 kilohertz peak. Now, it's not problematic all the time. It's only on certain recordings that it comes a little bit too forward and can be a little bit problematic. But for the most part, it's actually not too bad. There is a slight metallic tinge to the treble, but you know, this is where the detail comes from. This is where a good deal of that clarity comes from, along with the thinner upper bass and the leanness of the mid-range, all working together to create a very clear sound. The treble extension is quite good. The detail retrieval, as I mentioned, is very good, but the overall resolution of this earphone is a little bit disappointing actually, and I think that's due kind of to the brightness that comes from that 8 kilohertz peak. I won't go too deep down into this one, but I would say that the resolution is pretty ordinary, despite the detail retrieval being very good. So although they are related, they are definitely different things, and that is probably the weakest point, apart from that sort of stridency, which can be a little bit jarring and a little bit uncomfortable. Those two things are really the main issues I have with this earphone. And if you're into EQ, you can somewhat attenuate those problems, especially that harshness in the treble with some EQ. I don't use EQ personally, so for that reason, I wouldn't choose this as a daily driver. You know, overall, I think the sound is pretty good, but I don't think it's a game changer. I think a lot of people are going to like it for sure, especially ones who haven't kind of heard that more neutral presentation. But for myself, I just find it a little bit dry and kind of just slightly lacking in musicality and rhythm. Let's get into a couple of quick comparisons, and I'll start, of course, with the KZ original KZ ZEX. Now, I'll throw up the frequency response here. You can see that right away, right off the bat, that on the left side of the graph is where your bass is. Middle is the mid-range, obviously, and the right side of the graph is your treble region or high frequencies. Now you can see on the left of the graph where the bass is that it kind of rolls down a hill, and that is a sub-bass roll-off, which is one of the shortcomings of the original ZEX. And on the CRN here, we kind of have that reversed where the sub-bass takes precedence over the mid-bass. So they kind of swap roles in that regard. Now in the mid-range, they sound kind of similar. You can tell they're from the same family as such. There's a little bit more body and warmth and fullness to the mids of the ZEX original. Not a whole lot, but it's definitely there. And then in the treble, the ZEX here is basically very smooth in the top. It's not a strident sounding, as there's no sibilance as such. For some people it might actually sound a little bit lifeless or dull in the treble, as opposed to the CRN, which has quite a lively treble, but of course brings along with it some sibilance and some harshness at the same time. I would say, yeah, it's definitely, the CRN is definitely an upgrade over the original ZEX. However, if you don't like a bright tone and if you don't like sort of forward treble, then yeah, the ZEX would suit you better in that regard. And then we have the KZ DQ6. Now the DQ6 in terms of sound lies somewhere between the CRN and the ZEX. It has an improved sub-bass compared to the ZEX. It doesn't have that roll-off effect, but at the same time it's got a little bit more forward mid-bass as well, which I prefer over the CRN's kind of scooped out mid-bass and upper bass. Mid-range is quite similar indeed. They're both fairly lean. I would say there's probably just a little bit more body in the DQ6 lower mid-range in particular, but the DQ6 has a little bit more vocal presence. So vocals are a little bit more upfront and vibrant, but at the same time, they also have to contend with a kind of a more forward bass, so it kind of evens out. And as far as the treble goes, the DQ6 isn't quite as lively or aggressive as the CRN. Having said that, the DQ6 does have a couple of peaks. It can get a little bit shouty or a little bit forward and edgy at times, especially when you turn up the volume. But I would say the treble overall is smoother than the CRN. And in terms of technicalities, this goes for both the ZEX and the DQ6 compared to the CRN. Technicalities, I would say the clarity and the detail retrieval is slightly better on the CRN. Overall resolution is pretty similar on all of them, really. There's not a big difference in the resolving ability of these IEMs. As far as soundstage goes, I would say the CRN is a little bit wider than both of the other two. However, the DQ6 has got better forward depth in the soundstage. Instrument separation and imaging and those kind of things, they're all very similar between these three IEMs. The CRN does lose some of its composure during complex passages. It does get a little bit caught up in itself. It kind of gets caught up by that 8 kilohertz peak. It has a little bit of a treble glare, which sort of masks over the mid-range harmonics. But at the end of the day, shit, I'm talking about a $33 IEM, man. And of course, as usual for KZ, for that price, we're talking about a pretty good quality sound. Like I said, not something I would use for a daily driver, but I'm not mad at it. I can't wait to see what KZ does moving forward, because they're obviously shaking and moving, man. They're doing some very interesting things. But guys, I'm going to wrap it up there. That is the KZ Crinacle CRN or the ZEX Pro. Do I recommend it? Yeah, probably. It's going to depend on your personal preference. If you want something with a nice fat bass, this ain't going to do that for you. It's going to do half give you fat bass. It's going to give you a pretty fat sub bass, but the mid bass, like I said, bit dry, a bit shallow, a little bit lacking in body. But overall, I think most people who buy this are going to be quite pleased. So let's wrap it up, guys. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, Parfam audiophile style. And if you want to see more reviews like this in the future, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And until next time, see you later.